we? No, you're not in B right now. All right, it is 2 o'clock Central Standard Time, and we are ready to go with this week's study. Last week we began with a 5-part series on the accounts of Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection in the Gospels. And today we're going to start looking at each of those Gospel accounts in turn, beginning with the Gospel that we believe was written the earliest, the Gospel of Mark. I realized after I did the stream last week that I had misdated these 4 sessions. I'd given the Wednesday dates instead of the Tuesday dates, but hopefully you all were able to catch my mistake and update your notes accordingly if you're taking them. We'll be doing this the next 3 Tuesdays after today, the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd. So at least that is the plan. So today we go into the Gospel of Mark. The way we'll do this is we're going to talk about some sort of particular aspects of the Gospel of Mark that I think are worth lifting up, and then we're going to walk our way just through the accounts of Jesus' betrayal and death and resurrection, beginning with Jesus and his disciples going to the Mount of Olives. So let's get into it. I mentioned last week that each of the Gospels was written to, we believe, a particular community, or at least a particular sort of community, and that colors how the Gospel writers determined which accounts made it into their story of Jesus' life. We believe that Mark's Gospel was written right around the year 70, which, as I mentioned last week, is a really critical mark in the history of the Jewish people, because it was in the year 70 that the Roman army swept into Jerusalem and razed the temple. It was the end of the sacrificial system at the Jerusalem temple, and it led to a fundamental change in the way that Judaism was practiced. And that had an impact itself on Christianity and how it developed during that time. Traditionally, Mark is ascribed to the Roman Christian community, a community that was largely Gentile. That was particularly the case around the year 70 because one of the emperors in that general time period had expelled a number of the Jewish people from the city of Rome and from other major cities because they were accused of being of undermining the public order. By this time, they'd reestablished themselves. We have some vestiges of that, the conflicts that ensued in the letter to the Romans. But at this point, the Roman church was more Gentile than it was Jewish. And so in Mark, we see the use of some terms that need to be explained for the audience, whereas other gospel writers didn't need to explain those terms quite so freely. I think we often overestimate the amount of persecution that was going on in the early church. There's been this sort of historical idea that Christians on a broad scale were under attack. I don't think that was the case in this particular time period, but there were scattered instances of Christians facing religious opposition. And so Mark's audience may have been dealing with some of that, particularly as they lived in the seat of imperial power and were seen as maybe being a little more dangerous there than they would have been in the imperial backwaters of some of the other major communities. So Mark's gospel has sort of an undertone of inviting those who read it to hang in there in the midst of that opposition. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is referred to using 4 primary terms besides his name. The Christ or the Messiah. These are terms that are... Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, or anointed one. We have Jesus referred to as the Son of God. His own preferred self-appellation is the Son of Man. That's used an awful lot in Mark's gospel. And then particularly among demonic forces in Mark's gospel, Jesus is referred to as the Holy One of Israel or the Holy One of God. And so this is an appellation that's used for for Jesus there as well. The writer of Mark, we'll just call him Mark so I don't have to keep using that circumlocution, but Mark attempts to answer the question through his narrative, what does the life of Jesus mean? What is the significance of the life of this man, Jesus? There's a couple really unique things about the way Mark tells the story. The first is this idea of the messianic secret. You'll see repeatedly throughout Mark's gospel that something is discovered about Jesus. Jesus does something miraculous that makes his disciples understand something about who he is. The Transfiguration is a prime example of this in Mark chapter 9. Jesus is transfigured before his disciples. They get to see the glory of God revealed in his face. And the first thing he does when they leave the mountaintop is he orders them not to tell anyone what they'd seen. So Jesus does all these amazing things, but he's constantly at pains to keep what his disciples are experiencing from him under wraps, because in Mark's gospel, the fundamental understanding of Christ's life and death and resurrection has to be viewed through the resurrection. The understanding of Jesus is incomplete apart from that. And yet, there's this promise that that secret is going to eventually be disclosed. For there is nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. So even as Jesus constantly tamps down expectations, tamps down his disciples' desire to spread the message about him, Mark himself has Jesus saying that all is eventually going to be revealed. The disciples in Mark are a larger group than just the 12. In some of the other Gospels, Matthew in particular, when they talk about the disciples, it's basically synonymous with the 12 that Jesus chooses. But Mark presupposes that there's this broader circle of disciples, and the 12 are named particularly as a subset of that. In Mark's Gospel, the disciples are given all kinds of opportunities to understand who Jesus is. And over again, they fail to grasp the totality of who Jesus is and who Jesus is being revealed to be. And part of that is because, as I said before, the cross and resurrection are what help to sort of cement the understanding of Jesus. But Mark's account is interesting in that where you'd think that with more time with Jesus, the disciples would understand more and more about what's going on. It seems like the disciples get more dim as the gospel goes along. That they understand less in chapter 12, for example, than they did in chapter 3. It's the way Mark tells the story is to basically set the disciples up as stumbling, bumbling fools who are unable to figure out who Jesus is apart from Jesus revealing it to them, or God revealing it to them through the events of his suffering, death, and resurrection. In the end, the disciples' commitment falters. Jesus is left completely alone in his hour of greatest need by his closest disciples. The only exceptions to that in all the gospel accounts are the women who stand by and watch what's happening and then visit Jesus' grave later in the week. Mark has a sort of stock phrase that he uses throughout most of the gospel to describe those who are in opposition to Jesus. He describes those authorities as the elders, chief priests, and scribes. Once the Passion narrative begins, in chapter 14, you have these two other sources of opposition come to the fore. The first is the Sanhedrin, or those who are associated with the high priest. These are members primarily of the party of the Sadducees, but the Sanhedrin is this religious court or assembly that passes judgment on people. The other source of opposition is Pontius Pilate and those who are connected with him, and by extension with the Roman Empire. Both of these attempt to silence Jesus and prove him guilty of the offense that he's purported to have made against the temple or God on the one hand, and Rome on the other hand. But Mark is, though his Greek is rough, his sense of literary irony is great. And so throughout the account, the way that Jesus is treated and the way that Jesus is talked about is an ironic confirmation of everything that we as readers are learning about Jesus throughout the gospel. Lastly, how does Jesus' passion, which is the sort of shortened way of referring to his suffering, death, and resurrection, how does that reflect God's will? Well, God's plan is unfolding throughout this whole process. We can see that happening through the repeated use of this Greek verb paradidomi, which means to literally hand over or give over to, but is used sort of figuratively in the sense of betrayal. And it's often put in this passive grammatical construction, which in Mark's gospel is a primary way of Mark referring to God's divine activity. And so when Jesus is constantly being handed over again and again and again to various authorities or by other people, Mark intends for us to understand that that's happening exactly in accordance with God's plan. And for Mark, all the characters in the story are unwittingly contributing to the fulfillment of God's divine plan. Almost none of them understand that that's the case, but that's how Mark wants us to read what's going on. Okay, we're going to dig into the gospel account itself, but are there any questions before we dig into the narrative? Okay. Pick it up here in chapter 14, where Jesus and his disciples travel to the Mount of Olives. I fear I'm going to be doing more of the sort of reading things out loud to you than I'd like to, but that's sort of the nature of doing this type of a study. So I'll try to limit it as much as I can, but that's sort of the reality of what we're looking at here. So Jesus at the Last Supper and on the way to the Mount of Olives predicts that the disciples are going to abandon him. And he sort of previews what's going to happen. He says, well, after the third day, you can find me here. You'll know where to look for me. And the disciples, as is the case throughout Mark's gospel, have no clue what Jesus is talking about. They just don't get what's happening. Peter, for his part, protests that he will never leave Jesus behind. And the rest of the disciples agree. Even if it be necessary for me to die with you, I will not deny you. Jesus, of course, knows that Peter is not going to be faithful to that commitment. And in a detail that's unique to Mark, Jesus predicts that he will be denied 3 times before the cock crows twice. That's the only time in the 4 Gospels that particular formulation shows up. So they go to the Mount of Olives, and then Jesus takes this inner circle of Peter, James, and John. Again, still kind of mad that Andrew is not included in that group, but that's a different discussion. Jesus goes with these 3 into the garden. The rest of the disciples are a distance away. And Jesus is described as being distressed and disturbed. Jesus gives the disciples this command to keep awake and watch with him, and then he goes to pray. He prays using the Aramaic word Abba, or Father. All things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. We know in Mark's gospel that Jesus does not want to go through with this because he understands what it will mean for him as a person. But he also understands that God's will and being obedient to God's will is more important than what he wants. But he wants this hour to pass from him. That's a sort of critical term there because the hour will come up again later. Okay. Jesus returns and finds the disciples sleeping and rebukes them, and then this process repeats itself 2 more times for a total of 3 in good storytelling fashion. The rule of 3 is a very common storytelling device. And then at the conclusion of this episode, Jesus announces that his betrayer, the one who's going to hand him over, is at hand. We know from way back in the gospel that Judas is going to be the one to betray Jesus. In fact, Judas never has a chance to be presented any other way, because when Judas is called as a disciple, he's identified in the first instance that his name shows up as the one who would betray Jesus. So, poor guy. Never able to get out from under that particular, what's the term I'm looking for? That designation follows him from the very beginning in Mark's gospel. There's this irony as the kiss of friendship is used as the signal to identify who Jesus is, so he can be taken by the crowd. And then Jesus is seized, and someone in the crowd strikes one of the high priest's slaves. We don't know who it is. This is more definitive in some of the other gospel accounts, but it's left really vague in Mark's gospel. And then Jesus complains about the manner of his arrest, and in particular the fact that he taught everything openly and spoke very openly about what his ministry was about, despite the messianic secret that we talked about, but that he was being arrested under cover of darkness. That he did everything out in the open, but this was happening in this clandestine way. And then the disciples scatter, and there's this weird detail in the middle of that about this young man who runs away naked. Someone tries to catch him, and instead of getting a hold of him, they get a hold of the tunic that he's wearing. And he basically runs out of the tunic and keeps going and leaves his clothing behind. This seems incredibly random, almost like a non sequitur, but it will come back to us later on. So hold that thought about the young man. Okay. Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin, this sort of legal court that I talked about before, and the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes gather to find testimony to convict Jesus and to silence him. Problem is, they can't find any two people who will agree about what Jesus' actual crime is. So the testimony is both inconsistent, and it doesn't meet the burden of proof established in Deuteronomy, which is that someone's guilt or innocence will be determined by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if they can't find multiple people who will tell the same story, then they can't legally bring Jesus up on these charges. There's also some suggestion that because the trial is happening at night and not during the day, that it's an illicit trial, that it actually wouldn't have proper legal standing. But for Mark, that's part of the point, that Jesus is not legitimately guilty of anything, and yet he's going to be brought up on these charges. One of them, that he was plotting to destroy the temple, which had taken so long to build. And then the second, that he had this claim to be the Messiah, which they considered to be blasphemous. Jesus says nothing about the first one and basically admits the truth of the second one, which is what causes him to be convicted. The high priest tears his clothing and says, "You have heard what he said. Why do we need any more witnesses?" Jesus is convicted of this charge of blasphemy and sentenced to death. Problem is, the religious authorities don't have the legal authority to carry out a sentence of death. So Jesus is mocked and spat upon as he's taken off to Pilate, who does have the authority to administer a death sentence. During this mocking, Jesus is particularly mocked as being a prophet. Prophesy, who hit you? And yet, everything that Jesus says of a prophetic nature ends up being fulfilled if it hasn't been already in the gospel. So again, Mark's sense of irony is strong. The characters in the story here do not know that Jesus actually is a prophet, and they're mocking him as a prophet merely serves to confirm what we already know about Jesus as the people who are reading the story. We have this interesting sort of tableau where the scene shifts between Peter outside in the courtyard and Jesus inside at Pilate's. Peter's introduced here in chapter 14, verse 54, as having followed Jesus and making it to the courtyard of the high priest's house, or of Pilate's house. Excuse me. Yes. Okay, yes. So he's made it to the high priest's house. They go inside to show what's happening before the Sanhedrin, and then we zoom back outside to see what's been going on while Jesus has been questioned. Peter's out in the courtyard, and he is recognized and identified 3 times as an associate of Jesus in these words: "You were with Jesus the Nazarene." To which Peter responds, "I don't know what you're talking about." And the first crow happens. Then someone else says, "This man is one of them," which Peter denies, but we don't have the words he used for that. And then, "You're one of them, you're a Galilean." Peter's accent gives him away. And Peter says, just as the first time, "I don't know the man you're talking about." And then cock crows the second time. Peter recognizes what he's done, and he weeps bitterly at the denial that he's just carried out in accordance with what Jesus said would happen. Okay. Now the scene shifts again, and Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, who is often referred to as the Roman governor. The technical term for that position was the procurator of this province. Pilate's big question is, are you the king of the Jews? Pilate cares nothing about Jesus claiming to be any sort of divine religious figure. That is not anywhere on his radar. Pilate's only concern is whether Jesus is claiming some sort of temporal or political authority, because that sets him up in opposition to the people that Rome has put in charge. If that's the case, then he's got something to worry about. Otherwise, it's an internal religious dispute, and the authorities can do whatever they're going to do. Pilate doesn't have to concern himself with it. The chief priests shout out the charges that are against him. Of course, again, Pilate doesn't really care at all, and Jesus doesn't respond to any of them. Then Pilate talks about this tradition that doesn't seem to actually have any reference in the historical record about a prisoner being exchanged at the Passover. I think this is one of those places where Mark perhaps isn't reporting a verifiable historical event, but he's setting up this really dramatic picture in here, where Barabbas, which is a compound name, Bar meaning son of, and Abbas related to the word for father, where Jesus Bar Yosef, who we know to be the Son of God, this is our Jesus, the Jesus who's at the center of the gospel story. Jesus, the son of Joseph, we also know to be the Son of God, versus Jesus Bar Abbas, Jesus, the son of the Father. Barabbas is identified as a bandit, which is the reason for his arrest, his having been arrested in the first place. Note that when Jesus is arrested and betrayed, he asks why he's being treated like a bandit. And now Jesus is exchanged for a guy who has a similar name to him and who is legitimately been arrested and imprisoned for being a bandit where Jesus hasn't been. There's an intentional contrast put up there. Pilate knows why the religious authorities are really going after Jesus, and he protests that Jesus is really innocent of anything that he should care about. The crowd eventually is able to impress upon Pilate that Jesus is enough of a disturber of the peace that even if he doesn't care about this religious stuff, he's going to have a problem on his hands if he doesn't do what needs to be done. So Jesus is sentenced to death, mocked by the soldiers, and then handed over. When Jesus is mocked, he's mocked as king. But again, those who mock him as king unknowingly speak the truth about who Jesus is. There are direct allusions here to Isaiah chapter 53, which is the song of the suffering servant. the idea of the person who was despised and rejected and mocked and scourged. This is the picture of what we have here in Mark chapter 15. And then when Jesus is mocked and beaten by the soldiers, he's said to have been in the presence of the entire cohort of soldiers there. So this is a particularly brutal thing that's happened to Jesus. I should note that in this section, Jesus is handed over twice. He's first handed over to Pilate, and then he's handed over to the soldiers to be crucified. So again, this term, paradidomi, to be handed over or betrayed, shows up multiple times. Now we come to the crucifixion itself, which, as Mark generally does, is recounted in pretty spare language. Mark doesn't dwell on the details of this. In fact, he spends more time talking about how Jesus gets to the cross than he does talking about how Jesus is actually crucified. One of the people standing by watching this whole scene is a guy named Simon of Cyrene, and we're, I think, supposed to, at least Mark's implied audience is supposed to know who this guy is, or at least to know someone connected with him, because he's identified as the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, 2,000 years later, we have no idea who Alexander and Rufus are, but apparently the people who first read Mark's gospel, or for those people, this would have been a relevant piece of information. So there's Mark is telling us that this story comes from some, connection with known people. Mark isn't just making this up. Anyway, Simon is enlisted to assist Jesus, and what was most likely is, contrary to the picture in The Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson, where Jesus is dragging the entire cross along on the ground, crucifixion seems to have been carried out such that there were vertical stakes that were permanently planted at the site of execution. And then those who were crucified would carry the crossbeam that they would eventually be either nailed to or tied to, depending on how brutal the Romans wanted to be at that point. So Simon would have carried that crossbeam to the place of crucifixion because Jesus had been so battered already that he wasn't able to do it himself. They arrive at the place called Golgotha, which means skull in Aramaic, and it comes over into the Greek here. The place of the skull has sort of a dual meaning, because what we're looking at is either a hill that was shaped like the crown of a skull, or it's a reference to the fact that this was a place of death, and skulls, for obvious reasons, are associated with death rather than with life. Jesus, again, ramping up the irony, is crucified between two more bandits. Again, remember that Jesus asked why he was being treated like a bandit, and then he's continually associated with them and treated like them throughout this account, even though we know who he actually is. Jesus is mocked by passers-by. For them, his decision not to save himself proves that he's impotent, that he doesn't have the power to do it, where we are led to understand that Jesus chooses not to save himself even though he could. Jesus is even mocked by those who were crucified with him. So the humiliation is total. These guys are already being executed in the most humiliating way possible, and somehow even they are finding a way to look down on Jesus as he is also crucified. A couple other notes here. First, I haven't mentioned it in this study, but one of the characteristics of Mark's gospel is that it's sort of rapid fire. At the beginning of Mark's gospel, the word immediately shows up a ton of times. It shows up throughout the gospel more than any other place in the New Testament. So Mark has almost this comic book quality in terms of this happens and then this happens and this happens. You can almost see it drawn out in a storyboard form. But we get to the Passion narrative and time just slows down and stretches. You can see in the narration of the crucifixion that all these time markers start showing up. From the 3rd hour, such and such things happens. Then this happened at the 6th hour. And then the sky was dark until the 9th hour. There's these discrete markings of time where Mark's gospel previously would have recounted one event a day or one event a week or one event a month, and we're just speeding our way through Jesus' life. And now we get to this final day, and everything is so consequential that time is stretched and pulled so that we know what's happening almost every agonizing minute of the process. It really puts the focus narratively on what's going on here. The other thing I want to highlight here is that Psalm 22 echoes throughout this scene. It doesn't actually get checked, so to speak, until the next section of the gospel, and yet aspects of Psalm 22 are popping up throughout this whole section, even going back to Jesus being mocked and scourged before going out to the place of crucifixion. Now Jesus dies. Again, see how time is stretching out. We've had sort of the whirlwind trial and things like that, and now we've got here 12 verses that talk about the crucifixion of Jesus and the process that led to that. Here we've got 8 verses talking about Jesus' final moments. I mean, Mark is really wanting us to slow down and focus on what's happening. So here's the direct reference to Psalm 22, which begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from my cry and from the words of my groaning?" Jesus says only the first line here, and it's presented in, Jesus would have originally said this in Aramaic, and I'm never actually totally sure, but it would have been something like, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. So, Eloi sounds an awful lot like the beginning of the name of the prophet Eliyahu, Elijah. So people from the crowd misunderstand what Jesus is saying, and they think he's calling out for Elijah instead of calling out for his God. Jesus is offered a drink for the second time in this whole episode, and he refuses it. And then Jesus lets out a loud cry, and the word used to describe the moment of Jesus' death is that Jesus expired. That is, Jesus breathed out his spirit, the one given to him in his baptism in the Jordan. Some other of the gospel accounts say Jesus breathed his last, but this uses this really specific word. Jesus was inspired at his baptism, and at his death, he expires the Spirit. The sanctuary curtain is torn in two, just like the heavens at Jesus' baptism, where Mark describes them as being violently ripped apart and the Spirit of God descending. So Mark's account is bookended by this movement of the Spirit into Jesus, with the heavens being torn open, and then at the end, Jesus releasing the Spirit, or breathing it out, and the temple sanctuary curtain being rent apart. One of the people standing by says, "Truly this man was God's son." But the way Mark's told the story, we're not sure whether this is a sincere statement of faith or whether it's something ironic, like someone realized, or, this guy just died. He didn't do anything special. All he did was hang there and die, just like the bandits who were next to him. Sure, this guy was God's son. It could be either one of those particular readings, in distinction to Luke's gospel, where you have this presentation of a centurion who says, "Truly this man was innocent," in a way that, in the context of Luke's gospel, is much more likely to be a sincere statement of faith than this. As I said before, the 12 abandoned Jesus in his hour of need, but the women did not. They stood watching at a distance so they would know what happened to Jesus and were able to properly care for him and his body later on. Excuse me, I'm going to take a little drink here. Getting parched. Now Jesus is buried. We have introduced here Joseph of Arimathea, who requests the body from Pilate and then is granted the custody of the body so that he can bury it. This is ironic because Joseph is described as being a member of the council, the Sanhedrin, who met earlier. And at that point, Mark related that all agreed that Jesus deserved death. So the question is, did Joseph disagree the whole time? And he just stayed silent when the Sanhedrin agreed to pass the sentence of death? Or did Joseph agree before, and then having seen the manner in which Jesus died, he had a change of heart and understood what had happened and came to faith? Joseph is a much more prominent figure in Gospel of John than here in Mark's Gospel. But in any case, there's this sort of mystery here. Is Joseph someone who saw Jesus die and through the cross came to understand that Jesus was who he said he was? Or was he someone who didn't have the courage before to say what needed to be said, like one of the disciples? In either case, Joseph doesn't look great at the beginning, but he comes around to performing this really pivotal role in the story of Jesus' death. Jesus' body is placed in the tomb, and this stone is rolled in front to seal the tomb. This was a common practice at the time. And, as I said, the women are there watching the burial so that they know where Jesus is laid, and they can do the customary work of caring for his body and his burial site when it's appropriate for them to do so. They can't do it the next day, because the next day is the Sabbath, but the following day, they have the opportunity to do it, and that sets the stage for Mark chapter 16, the resurrection. Mark has, I believe, the most crowded of the resurrection scenes. I'm not sure, but we got 3 people going to the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. They bring these spices to anoint the body in keeping with normal burial practices. But as they're going, they're wondering what's going to happen. Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? And when they show up, the stone has already been rolled away. And look who's sitting there. A young man wearing a white robe was sitting on the stone. Remember the young man from before?
Naked?
Yes, the young man who had his garment grabbed onto, who ran away naked because his very clothing had been stripped for him, this sign of ultimate shame. And then here, at the resurrection, we have a young man appearing again, clothed in a white robe, sitting on the stone, and bearing witness to what had happened to Jesus. The young man's not named, and some people would argue that this is an incidental detail, but at least the way that I was taught about the Gospel of Mark, I don't think this is incidental. I think Mark's making a profound theological statement about the utter humiliation of that young man leaving Jesus behind in his hour of need and then being restored to the point where he's able to share this world-changing news with the women who showed up at the tomb that morning. And as is often the case in the Gospels, when someone is unnamed like this, and there's really, they're not described in really any other way, the reader is in a way invited to put themselves into the place of that person. So, who is this young man? Well, it could be any one of us, who when things get really tough may fall away, but who have the promise that in Christ, through Christ's death and resurrection, they can be restored and renewed. And then tell the story. You seek the one who was crucified. He has been raised. In some of the other gospel accounts, there's this really clear emphasis on the crucifixion as a sort of ongoing reality. Jesus would be described as the one who has been crucified and is raised. But here, crucifixion is a simple past event. Oh, he was crucified, but now he has been raised. And that fact of being raised continues to be the case. Then the young man says, "Go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, just as he told you." And then, in the biggest shock you could possibly have, the gospel ends in verse 8. The women reported to have said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And in fact, the way the sentence is written out in Greek makes no sense. Like if you translate it, no one who wrote Greek in this period of time would have written this sentence the way that they did. It ends in what's called a post-positive, with a post-positive particle, the sort of thing that would normally be towards the front of a sentence but not the first word, but the sentence ends with this word gar, which means for or because. It's a coordinating conjunction, the way that for or and or because would be. So literally it would be something like, the women said nothing to no one, afraid was because. It's a completely ungrammatical sentence. We've had to shift words around. And word order is not as important in Greek as it is in English, but fact remains, it's written in this really ham-handed way that almost doesn't make sense. But the broader point is, the women, for all of their faithfulness, had this one job, to go back to the disciples and tell them what had happened. And the last thing we read in the gospel, as we think it was originally composed, is that the women didn't say anything because they were too afraid to share the news. What does that mean? It's an open-ended story, intentional or otherwise. Did the women ever share the message? I mean, well, they must have. But I think the implication is the women were too afraid to say anything, but you know the story too, and now you can go and share this good news with other people. There's no reason for you to be afraid because you know that Jesus has been raised. So, again, Mark's gospel is in one way sort of wrapped up in a neat bow. Jesus' ministry begins in Galilee and it ends in Galilee when he meets his disciples there following his resurrection. But then there's also this sort of unsettling end to it. Okay. Now we address one of the elephants in the room, which is that if you have your Bible open, you've gotten to verse 8 and you're like, there's more stuff there. What do we do with that? Well, most scholars think that there were two different endings to the gospel. Well, I guess three. There was the gospel ending at verse 8 here, and they said nothing to no one, afraid was because. And then there's a short addition to verse 8 in some manuscripts, and then there's a longer ending that encompasses what in your Bibles is probably listed as verses 9 through 20. I don't know why, but I don't have my Bible in front of me. I think I'm going to go grab it because I think it's worth reading these in full so we can see why this is so weird. So I'll be right back. It's a good thing my office is close. Here we are. Okay. Let's go through these in turn. So first, the shorter ending of Mark. Start in verse 8. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And all that had been commanded them they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Couple things. First, Mark just said, they ain't say nothing to anybody. So what is this? It's a real contradiction. It's a real clash. And secondly, what is this? The sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation? There's nothing like that anywhere else in Mark's gospel. Mark doesn't write like that. Jesus doesn't talk like that. Nobody in the gospel says anything that looks like that. And suddenly we've got this stuff about the sacred and imperishable proclamation of God, of eternal salvation. most biblical scholars who have, who know Greek and have dug into Mark's language recognize that this was not written by the same person. It would be like having, no offense to high schoolers, but it would be like having a high schooler write a paper and then someone with a PhD in the subject writing the last paragraph. I mean, it's just going to be different. And so most people think this is a later addition to the gospel, written primarily to deal with how unsettling the ending of the gospel is in chapter 8. How could the gospel end with the women saying nothing to anyone because they were afraid? One, because it doesn't really make sense, because obviously someone heard. Someone had to have been told. But also just because of what it says about end of the gospel and the fate of the church. It's unsettling in a way that I think some people couldn't handle. And so we've got this. Now let's look at the longer ending. Okay. Now after he, Jesus, rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. Typical men. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it. If you've read the other gospel accounts, you can see some real parallels between what is written here in verses 9 through 20 and some of the stuff that shows up at the end of some of the other gospels. So, for example, there's this story about the Jesus appearing first to Mary Magdalene, and then her going back and telling them, but them not believing her, very much like John's gospel, for example. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country, very reminiscent of the road to Emmaus story in Luke's gospel. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, again, very much like John's gospel. And then there's some stuff here that just isn't really like Mark in some other ways. Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. Well, that sounds quite a bit like Matthew at the end. And then, even then, there's one more variant that I've got in a footnote here. I don't know if you guys have this. Tacked onto chapter 16, verse 20. Other ancient authorities add, in whole or in part, here's the text, "And they excused themselves," the disciples, saying, "This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now." Thus they spoke to Christ. And Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven." Again, wildly different from anything that Mark writes anywhere else. There's all this other stuff about the influence of Satan and stuff like that. Mark's gospel talks about Satan, but in rather crude terms, and always in such a way that Satan is revealed to be utterly impotent, right? Because compared to Jesus, there's no possibility of Satan ever prevailing. So we've got these 3, 4, whatever endings, and they're all in some way either totally dissonant when you compare them to what Mark writes, or when they seem consonant with it, they also seem so consonant with the other accounts of Jesus' gospel that it's almost too cute, you know? It's almost like people had gotten a hold of these other accounts of Jesus' resurrection, and they thought Mark needed some help to make clear what was going on here. And so they took some of these other traditions and tacked them onto the end of Mark's gospel. Why does this matter? I mean, in some ways it doesn't, because the things that appear in these additional sections in many ways comport with Orthodox Christian belief. I mean, there's the stuff about handling snakes and drinking poisons and stuff like that that's a little off the wall. But besides that, you know, the idea that the disciples went and preached to all nations, well, I mean, we kind of know that ended up happening. So these parts don't have to be rejected as not being important. But adding them on, I think, introduces more difficulties to reading Mark's gospel in isolation than it solves. They're interesting as windows into how the early church was wrestling with who Jesus was. But in terms of understanding what Mark was trying to write, I don't think are terribly helpful in that respect. So, back to that question that we said Mark's gospel was trying to answer. What does this mean? What does the passion of Jesus mean? On the cross, Jesus' true identity is finally revealed for all to see. The disciples, throughout their time with Jesus, get less and less proficient at understanding who Jesus is. But after the humiliation of crucifixion and the glory of resurrection, they have the possibility of understanding what's going on. These are the key to actually getting it when it comes to knowing who Jesus is. Jesus' passion and death and resurrection are all part of the plan. In Luke's gospel, for example, Jesus is presented as an innocent victim of a corrupt system. You know, they wouldn't use those terms, but Jesus' innocence is stressed over and over and over again. Mark doesn't have time for that. It's not a consideration for him, really. What happened because that's the way God intended for it to happen. And then here, at the end, maybe the most important thing for us as people reading the gospel. As Jesus' followers, we may stumble and fail him, perhaps even spectacularly so, as in the case of Peter. But Jesus goes ahead of us all the time and promises to meet us along the way. There's no doubt that discipleship and the cross are difficult things. Jesus isn't calling us to an easy life. And yet there's always the promise that Jesus will remain with us even when we don't remain with him. And that's good news for anyone who wants to live in relationship with God through Christ. It is 2:53. Are there any questions, comments, or rude remarks before we conclude today's? Yes.
Do you think chapters or verses 9 through whatever it was at the end were added at that time, or were they added later? Do you think?
I would guess somewhat later. There's a footnote here. This is the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which is considered to be one of the basic scholarly standard study Bibles. They note on the longer ending, possibly written in the early 2nd century and appended to the gospel later in the 2nd century. These sentences borrow some motifs from the other gospels and contain several unusual apocryphal elements. So they seem to be part of some developed traditions that arose some years later. And if Mark was written in around the year 70, then we're talking about things that may be 30 to 40 years later than that. So a full generation or more. All right. We'll be back at it next week as we look at the Gospel of Matthew, which we think was the first one of the Gospels to have been written with Mark as a source. But we'll see how Matthew's account is different in some really significant ways that lift up Matthew's particular concerns about how we're supposed to understand who Jesus is. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you for being here. We'll see you again next week at 2 o'clock, God willing. Take care, everybody.